Hey Geometry, we're going to color some quadrilateral properties today. Before we get started, I'm going to remind you about a few indicators that we like to put on diagrams. First one is an arrowhead, which means parallel. The second one is a tick mark, and that means congruent. The third one is a curve or an arc that we like to put on an angle, which means an angle is congruent. And the last one is the box that we like to put in an angle to indicate a right angle, which is worth 90 degrees. So those are some of the indicators we're going to use. Starting with our parallelogram, the first property is opposite sides are parallel. So we're going to color it like this using the arrowheads. Left and right are parallel. Top and bottom are parallel. Opposite sides are congruent. Going to use the tick marks here. Left and right are congruent. Top and bottom are congruent. The next one is opposite angles are congruent. So I'm going to use the curves here. I'm going to put one curve there and in the top right, and then I'm going to do a double curve, top left and bottom right. Consecutive angles are supplementary is the next property. So the way I'm going to do that is like this. I got one curve there, two curves there, and I'm going to draw a little arrow at each of those, and I'm going to say equals 180. So they would add to make 180. And I'm also going to do another double curve there. I'm going to draw a little arrow at both of those, and those would also equal 180. So long story short, the red plus blue would equal 180. Consecutive angles are supplementary. And then the last property for parallelograms, diagonals are bisected. So I'm going to draw one diagonal like this, and the second diagonal like this. And then I'm going to put some tick marks to show that these diagonals are bisected. Moving on to the rectangle. Opposite sides are parallel, so no surprise here, starting out the same way we did with the parallelogram. And opposite sides are congruent. All angles are congruent, which means 90 degrees each. So going to use the boxes to indicate 90 degrees right angles. The diagonals are bisected. This time I'm going to do the diagonals in the same color. You'll find out why in a minute. But they're bisected, so going to put the tick marks on there. And I use the same color for the diagonals because the diagonals are congruent. And I'm just basically going to do the exact same thing that I did with the bisected property to indicate that they're congruent. Moving on to the rhombus. Opposite sides are parallel. All sides are congruent, so this time everything's going to get a single red tick mark. Then opposite angles are congruent. There's the reds. There's the blues. Next, consecutive angles are supplementary. So like we did back over here for the parallelogram, we're going to try to show that our red and blues would add to 180. Sorry if this is going to get a little small. Equals 180 there. And then we could have the equals 180 also on this other side. Next property, the diagonals are bisected. All right. Two different colors for the diagonals here again. All right. So got the tick marks to show they're bisected. That looks great. Next, the diagonals are perpendicular. So this means that the diagonals are going to make 90 degrees. So I need to use the box to indicate 90 degrees. And then last for the rhombus, the diagonals bisect opposite angles. So here is the way this is going to look. Got the diagonals. They bisect opposite angles. So to indicate that the opposite angles are bisected, we're going to do one curve there and one curve there. Same thing on that opposite angle. And then we're going to do two sets of double curves on the other opposite angles just like that to show that they're bisected. Moving to the back, we've got the square, which has the most properties out of any of these quadrilaterals. So the square starts with opposite sides are parallel. And all sides are congruent. Everything gets a single red tick mark. All angles are congruent, 90 degrees each. So all angles get the box. The diagonals are bisected. I'm going to do the diagonals in the same color this time. You'll find out why in just a second. The diagonals are congruent. That's why I use the same color. And then the diagonals are perpendicular. So like we did for the rhombus, going to draw the box there and the box there to indicate that they make 90 degrees. And then the last property for the square, the diagonals bisect opposite angles. All right. So we're going to do sets of single curves, there and there, there and there, there and there, there and there. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this property is that each of those green marked angles is going to be 45 degrees each. 45 degrees each. Moving on to the kite, two sets of consecutive sides are congruent. That means that we're going to put a single red tick on the two sides near the top, and we're going to put blue double ticks on the two sides near the bottom. Next, one set of opposite angles is congruent. The opposite angles that are congruent are these that I'm marking with the red curves. The other opposite angles are not congruent. The next property, one diagonal is bisected. So I'm going to draw the diagonals for the kite. The diagonal that's bisected is actually the blue one. So I'm going to put the green ticks on the blue to show that it's bisected. Next, the diagonals are perpendicular. All right, so we did with the rhombus and the square. I'm going to put our 90-degree boxes. And then the last property for a kite, one diagonal bisects opposite angles. So the diagonal that does that is the red diagonal. So what I'm going to show here is a set of single curves near the top and a set of double curves near the bottom. So those are the opposite angles that are getting bisected. It's only the red diagonal that bisects the opposite angles. And then our last quadrilateral is the isosceles trapezoid. Its first property is one set of opposite sides is parallel. That would be the top and bottom. Those are the only opposite sides that are parallel. Next, one set of opposite sides is congruent. That would just be the left and the right side of the trapezoid, which we call the legs. Next, the base angles are congruent. So here's an example of base angles, these reds. Here's another example, these blues. So the base angles are congruent. The next one, leg angles are supplementary. So let me draw those reds and blues again. But this time, let me draw the arrows at them, and let me say that they equal 180. And same thing over here. And then the last property, the diagonals are congruent. So let's use the same color for these two diagonals. And then I'm going to mark them up just like this to show that they're congruent. So that's going to do it for coloring our quadrilateral properties.